This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Amy Bloom describes herself as a slow writer who wants to make use of everything. You might know her from her best-selling book, In Love. The memoir follows her journey with her late husband, who was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. Bloom's latest book is different. Blunt Instrument is a vivacious and often hilarious murder mystery that's set in the world of academia. She recently sat down with us to talk about her new book and writing process. Let's dive into the conversation. So, Amy, you've had multiple career paths and worn so many hats on your writing journey, really, including as a psychotherapist and as a professor. When did writing become something you realized that you wanted to do?
Well, I imagine that I had wanted to do it. I mean, I did do it. I wrote some really, really bad poetry when I was in ninth grade, but I was very committed to that, especially my poetry about trudging through the snows of Russia, not something I had actually experienced. But then I sort of put it aside. My dad, both my parents were reporters. My dad made his whole career as a journalist. And then when I was in my not quite mid-30s, I thought, oh, I know, I'll become a psychoanalyst. And I went to talk to the guy who was willing to be my training analyst, and he was lovely and attentive and said, absolutely, I will take you on. And I thought, that's great. And then on my way home, I drove past Wesleyan, where I had been an undergraduate for a couple of years, and thought about my bartending days there and just envisioned an entire murder mystery in which a body is found dead behind a divan in the president's house. And I decided that it seemed like there were stories I wanted to tell rather than stories I only wanted to listen to. And I started working on that mystery and cleverly put it aside for about 25 years and then went back to it, using it as a little bit of a sketch for what would eventually become Blunt Instrument.
That's amazing that sort of where was one stepping point, it didn't continue, but you came back to it at some point. So we'll definitely return to that in a second here. But because I think it's rather unique to sort of, I mean, I feel like most people's paths are crisscrossed, right? You plan to do something, it doesn't really happen the way you think it's going to. You go on doing something different, and usually people enjoy it, or they don't, and they move on. But you worked in these professions. I'm curious to hear if there's an overlap, because I tend to think there's some sort of connection between one plan to the next plan to the next plan. Because when I think of being a psychotherapist, I picture you sort of actively listening and taking things in, but you're also servicing someone at the same time. But I also imagine that the insights you might receive from the people you're listening to could potentially help you as a writer, and vice versa. Is that something that resonates with you, or am I just making that up?
I don't think you're just making it up. I think it's a reasonable observation. People have said that to me. To me, the overlap between the paths is almost always the person. The real overlap between, for example, writing and being a psychotherapist is me, which is I find people endlessly interesting. I have like two real sort of passions, and that is sort of love and language. And so it is not surprising to me that I really like being a psychotherapist. I think I'm pretty good at it. I've been doing it for an extremely long time. And I really love writing. And one is all about me, which is the writing, and the other one is all about the other person and the work that we can do together. But the overlap is language and love and human beings. So those are the things I'm always driven towards, I think.
Well, and another way of observation too is talking about the places that you've been. I think Connecticut is a really special and unique place. Many outside of the state, including myself when I first moved here, might not realize that it is a state that's overflowing with writers, academics, artists, you name it. And your new book, which we will dig deep into in a little bit here, takes place right here in Connecticut. You know, how has
Hmm.
living in Connecticut and working in Connecticut academia informed how you write about the state?
Well, I didn't think of myself as being from Connecticut for many, many years, but
Hmm.
I realized at some point I had to sort of stop saying, oh, I'm a New Yorker,
Sure.
because I live in Connecticut and have lived here almost all of my adult life. I was a waitress and a bartender in New Haven. Um, I worked at the Anchor before it was the nice, attractive, more upscale place that it is now. I waitressed at the late Clark's Dairy for a long time. And so a lot of my roots are very much in New Haven. And getting to teach in New Haven and at Wesleyan were not things that I expected. They were not on my bingo card. I thought I'd probably be a waitress till I was about 50, and then I'd have to find something else that wasn't so hard on my feet. But I think I like the water, so that's a big part of the draw of Connecticut for me. And I like sort of the psychic shape of it. I New Haven is I really think of as sort of my town in some ways, but there are lots of places in Connecticut that I really like and that surprise me and comfort me and charm me. And so I wouldn't have thought so 40 years ago, but it turns out I feel happy and lucky to live here, and never more so than in the current climate.
I mean, you mentioned that you were surprised that you stayed. What is it about Connecticut that inspired you to stay?
I think there is, for me anyhow, we certainly have big cities, but New Haven to me is really like a large town. Um, I have no sense of direction. I mean, I have a really violent nonsense of direction, and I can find my way around New Haven.
That's
You
a
know,
that's a big deal. I'm a landmark type of person.
I am
So,
only a landmark kind of person and not as good at that as I wish I was. But if I can get to Sandra's Next Generation, and I can get to the ER at Yale New Haven, and I can get to Liuzzi's for cheese, I know what I'm doing.
life's golden, I think, in that way. And so before we get into your new book, I think many readers and fans know you from your memoir, In Love, a memoir of love and loss. And so for those who are not familiar, this is a memoir that follows your journey with your late husband who was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's and your decision to travel to Switzerland so he could end his life with dignity. And so this book was published in 2022. It was your first memoir after writing several short stories and novels. And this is certainly, I think, a conversation that has risen and been ongoing since then and out in the forefront of people's minds. What was it like for you going from writing fiction to really opening yourself up to be so vulnerable and going into this very personal story?
Yeah, that was not my favorite thing. I did not clap my hands and go, oh, good, an opportunity to share my soul
Sure.
plainly with readers. In fiction, you can't hide. I mean, writers can tell themselves that they can, but you can't. But with a memoir, the goal was to try not to hide. And, Brian, before he died, had said to me, please write about this. And that was my direction. And that was my intention. I did not actually particularly have a wish to write a memoir about that or about any other thing. But he felt so strongly, and I think he was right, that this is a really difficult thing to navigate and to negotiate, and um, exceptionally difficult in the United States. And he really wanted me to share his decision making and his journey and what that looked like for us and for him and for me. And so I did, and I wrote it um, within the year that he died. I mean, I did a lot of editing, but um, I didn't think that I could come back to it 5 years later with a different perspective. I thought I'm either doing this now or I'm not doing it, and I know he wanted me to do it.
And with a topic that's so sensitive and personal, I think a signature that you have here is there's a lot of humor when you were and are grappling with grief. And this is something that we talk about a lot actually on the show with the team, with our conversations, is we do encourage humor when we're talking about very serious topics. Because I don't think personally and professionally that humor takes away from the grief, or it doesn't take away from the seriousness of the topic, but it's a way for many people to digest, what they're trying to sort of understand or to accept. So, because there's a lot of humor in your book, is that something, or in your memoir, was that something that you did intentionally, or do you think that's a part of your fabric of being?
I think that's part of my fabric of being. Um, and also, I think there's a real difference between humor which deflects, which is particularly cruel or dismissive or evasive, you know. That's the kind of humor that's usually followed by somebody saying something like, "Can't you take a joke?"
Mm.
Um, which strikes me usually as not being very much about humor. And then there is the kind of humor. A very dear friend of mine was dying, and I was spending a lot of time by his bedside. And his other bestie, who was a much older gentleman, a peer of his, would come in and we would go back and forth because I would put some music on the playlist, which was the music that he and I enjoyed. And then his bestie, his other bestie, my nemesis, would come in and put on Mahler and Beethoven. And we had been happily listening to Ella and Sarah Vaughan. And we really did have this ongoing battle. And I have to say, happily, it made us both laugh out loud. And so I think there's humor that is connected to, deep and entwined with grief. And then there's the other kind, which I don't have much use for.
Do you think people are surprised by that? Because I think there's still, I don't want to call it a taboo, but I think there is a sensitivity. I think people think, oh, it's something serious, it's something sad. We should not laugh about it. There should be no laughter.
I don't know. I have lived my whole life with lots of serious and sad things, and humor seems to come up pretty regularly. I think so. My dad, years ago, was telling me about the death of a good friend of his. Both of these men were in their 90s. And my dad says, "Oh, yeah, I just heard that, Max passed." I said, "Oh, Daddy, I'm so sorry. It's a real loss." He said, "Yeah, well, at least there's no suspicion of foul play." And so
There's a silver lining.
those are my people.
That was Connecticut author Amy Bloom. She's the author of many books, including her latest novel, Blunt Instrument. And readers, we want to meet you. On Saturday, June 13th at 10 a.m., join our team at Grace's Place in Meriden for a few hours of fun mingling and a book swap. There's no assigned reading and no pressure, just a relaxed afternoon among fellow book lovers. Registration is required, so visit ctpublic.org/whereweread. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. We'll be right back. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're talking with best-selling multi-genre author Amy Bloom. Her latest book is Blunt Instrument. It's a murder mystery set in the world of academia. Let's dive back into the conversation. So as an author, kind of touched on it a little bit just now, where you've explored multiple genres. So you've done, coming of age stories, historical fiction, short stories, nonfiction. So you were inspired to write a crime novel very early in your career. What made you want to come back to this so many years later?
Well, I thought it had some possibilities, and I'm kind of a slow writer, so I don't like to waste anything. And I thought, well, let me look at this again. I mean, I do remember that there was some good dialogue, and I remember there were a few characters I liked, and I remember that I did think to myself, I really need to learn how to write a mystery before I go any further. because I liked reading them, but I certainly hadn't studied them. And then I got the hang of the idea of things like multiple suspects, um, intersecting timelines, red herrings, all of those things. And I just thought a couple of years ago, I thought, oh, let me just give this another look. And then, and then sort of took it on so that it became the book that I had had an idea about a long time ago, but no idea how to write.
Mm.
And this time the parts came together uh, better and a little more easily. And when the very first time I wrote it, I really didn't know that much about. I mean, I had been an undergraduate and I had been a faculty wife, but having then had another 20 years at Wesleyan and at Yale, that certainly gave me more understanding of academia than I had had before. Now I feel like I've sort of done all the corners.
Right. And well, actually, as you were sharing that, I'm curious to hear when you went back to your draft, was it like meeting old friends or was it like opening up a diary and you're like, wow, I can't believe I wrote this 20 years ago?
Somewhere in between, if you have a picture of yourself, maybe when you're in an unfortunate clothing stage, maybe you're 20, maybe you're 19, maybe you thought it was a really good idea to do that with your hair.
Mm.
Um, it was a little bit like that. I'm like, oh, that seems unfortunate.
So
Well,
the
that's not
the the
bad.
crime was you wrote that draft, essentially, is what you're saying.
I needed to write that draft. And I am a big fan of rewriting, and I do not ever expect a first draft to be what I want it to be. So for me, the opportunity to revise is a gift, always. And so for me, to look at all the things that didn't work or were awkward or stupid or simply missing, this was a great chance to build the house properly.
Well, I bet a lot of people would love to hear that the first draft is never the perfect draft and that revising is really important as a part of the process.
I would say it again, revising is a gift as an opportunity. It is a chance to serve your work and make it what you wish it to be. And that's a climb. I mean, sometimes you get a beautifully smooth sentence and you're thrilled with yourself. And sometimes that even flows into a couple of paragraphs. And then then you hit the curb and you do something dumb and something unfortunate happens and you drop the bag of groceries. And that's what revision is for. So you can fix that.
My house tends to be extremely clean when I have a moment of, I think I can do something else for now and just kind of avoid actually doing the work. So,
Sure,
um,
sure.
and so I am personally a really big crime fiction reader. Love has always loved the genre, and sort of grew up in a time when you are told by adults that it's not real reading or it's not serious literature. I'm wondering
Mhm.
from you yourself, you mentioned that you liked reading crime fiction, but you went back and actually studied the craft. Why do you think it has been viewed as not serious literature, and how do you respond to that?
Well, it's not as if novels have been around for a really, really long time. And I suspect that, the people who wrote them in the first place got a good head start on declaring what was serious literature and what was not. But, if we had been around when Jane Austen was being reviewed, we would have had to gnash our teeth at the reviews which described these as mildly amusing stories by a country lady. That certainly sounds like chick lit to me, and it certainly sounds like a dismissal. And I think art takes all forms. I mean, to me, honestly, sort of dismissing a great mystery because it is a mystery is like saying about, a Monet, I don't care for it. It's not a sculpture. It's like, well, you may have misunderstood the point. And so, um, sure, there is formulaic and tedious writing in mysteries. There can be. I have also read my fair share of literary novels in which, after the eighth page, I'm like, no, no, not for me. And so I don't think it matters very much what you call it. I think there is often a reliable shape to a mystery, which is why we call it a genre. Um, but it's all about what you do with it. I mean, it's like a haiku. You've got this number of syllables. What makes the difference between something great and something serviceable is what you do with it. And that's sort of how I feel about genre fiction in general, which is like, is your goal the formula, or is your goal to do something as good as you can do within that vessel?
And so you're talking in a space too where we're pretty big fans of murder mysteries or fantasy fiction set in an academic setting. So big dark academia fans here, and of course, being in Connecticut, we have so much inspiration for the setting. So what made you decide that you wanted your murder mystery to be set in a college campus?
Well, I have spent a fair amount of time on college campuses one way or another, and there was something, I don't think I thought of it at the time, but there is something really about the fact of having been an undergraduate, been a very young faculty wife, and then been a professor at two different universities. I just felt like this is a world I know pretty well. And and it's fun and it's interesting to navigate. I would like to have a life in which I could set my entire murder mystery brilliantly in 15th century Venice. But honestly, I have only been to Venice a couple of times and I've never been to the 15th century, and I didn't feel that that was in my range. I really wanted to set this in something contemporary and that I felt I knew in my bones. It's like I don't mind doing research. I love doing research. It's a great alternative to writing. But this was something where I felt like I already had almost everything I needed to write the book.
And so I'm surrounded by academics. And so I sort of vicariously live through that life. And so when I pick out certain things from your novel, I'm like, oh, I am familiar with that. Or that's familiar, that's something that I see through my friends' eyes and experiences. And I feel like there's a fascination that you've presented here where there's lots of trials, lots of perils working in academia. And from my sort of vicarious experiences through grad school and people teaching, it's always a lot more complicated than you think. People are complicated in various settings, but academia seems to be a different level of that. And academic politics can also be pretty ruthless and whatnots in whatever setting that you're in. So, how did you work to translate that ruthlessness to the page? I don't want to get into the weeds of what's fiction and what's nonfiction, but what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I don't know that academics are any more ruthless than orthopedic surgeons or car salesmen. You know, I don't
Sure.
know. I don't know those fields quite as well. But um, one of the things often in academia is that the people who are drawn to it are often drawn to their subject, wish to have a certain kind of intellectual life that is at the center of their work, and wish to protect that and also to protect whatever position they have. And I think those things are complicated for many reasons. Including, institutions have conflicting wishes. They want to take care of the people who teach there, but they also don't want to have to overpay them, or they want to keep the star so that you can keep the department open. And, you go through various phases in the world in which, students are idealized, or, you go to the other end and they are customers. So there's always movement. I mean, universities respond to the world around them. They are not cut off. In fact, I always thought of the ivory tower as sort of, I don't think that's really how it is. I think, these are, they may be ivory towers. They're also apartment buildings. They're also caves. They're also huts. And people come and they find themselves, part of what is striking about universities is that you are in a little bit of a beehive. Lots of hives right near each other. And sometimes their wishes and their intentions and their goals overlap. And, I remember at one point I moved into an office, and the upstairs of the building that I was in had several elderly faculty people, all of whom kept their dogs, all of whose dogs were in varying degrees incontinent. And I was the only person who thought this was a problem. And that's what makes it fun to set things in academia.
And so I want to talk about your main character, Dell, a little bit here, because Dell has sort of left the life of academia, actually, and we learned that Dell has some anger issues, and then she becomes a private detective by chance, not by choice. It seems like a lot of the genre, when we were talking about the main detectives, they seem to have had a past before coming into this profession. How did you develop this with Dell specifically? Was that something that you were thinking about, that you wanted her to have something deeper before coming into detective work?
The idea that somebody would come into detective work at 21, having had a lovely, sparkly, blemish free childhood, strikes me as an unlikely premise. Every grown up has a past. You don't get to be a grown up without a past. And so I gave her something that I thought made sense to me. I liked the idea of somebody who started out as an English professor, somebody who was educated, somebody who was smart, somebody who was literate. And I wanted to sort of give her some depth and not just snappy one liners. I mean, you bring who you are to the project, whatever it is. And I wanted her to be as much of a whole person as possible, with her strengths, which are considerable, and also with the ways in which she cannot get out of her own way. And I think because I wrote Blunt Instrument the way I wrote it, there are things that are not resolved. You know, some bad things happen, and we're still not sure why.
Well, and I have to ask, just and it's not a spoiler because it's on the book cover, but because it's called Blunt Instrument, and the blunt instrument is a bust of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter. I want to know what the story is behind using him as a murder weapon.
I needed a bludgeon. I really wanted a bludgeoning death, and I'm sorry to say that that was something I was quite keen on. And I had a few candidates in mind, but I couldn't bring myself to have somebody be bludgeoned to death with a bronze bust of Emily Dickinson. That didn't seem right. I'm not going to have somebody bludgeoned to death with a bronze bust of Audre Lorde. But I was like, Nathaniel Hawthorne, there's the dark and the light and the blood. And I'm like, that seems good.
Yeah, I
Let's
mean,
go with that.
and you got the Scarlet. It
Mm-hmm.
makes
I
sense.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Well, and then coming back to Dell for a second here, because she's such an interesting character, and I do find a lot of detectives, the character works because they're flawed. They're trying to find an answer to something, but it seems like most of the time they're also trying to find answers for themselves. And so I'm curious to hear, is Dell inspired by anyone in particular, or is she many people's sort of characteristics into a whole person?
I feel like there are sort of strands of all sorts of things. I mean, I like her feistiness. I like the fact that, she's clever, but sometimes she gets in her own way. Um, I like sort of seeing how she thinks and how she pursues things, and also the things that she doesn't feel like she's very good at. She cannot consistently keep her mouth shut. It would be better if she did. I'm also very sympathetic because I have that problem myself. So I think, she's a combination of qualities that I really liked, but I did not want her just to be sort of winged vengeance or two or three qualities. I really wanted her to be as much of a whole human being as possible, which is why, her parents make appearances in the novel, her relationships make appearances in the novel. She makes mistakes, she makes errors in judgment. Some she can fix and some she can't. And I just wanted her to be as much of a human being, an interesting human being, but a human being as possible.
I think hearing you describe Dell, there's so much love for her as you're talking about her, and obviously you wrote her, so there's that, and I think you've spoken about having a love for character-driven stories. So I feel very similar personally too. Like I feel like oftentimes I'm very character first, plot second. If I'm
Mhm.
really attached to the character, to me it doesn't really matter what the story is doing. I want to know what happens to the character. Do you always have to love your characters in order to write about them? Although, and we talked about Hubert earlier, Dell is hilarious, but obviously she has a lot of things going on too that are not funny.
Yeah, I mean, she's just a person with a good sense of humor, and I don't think you always have to like your characters, but I do think you have to love them, and I think you have to be willing to stay with them. There is nobody I write who is just a villain, not in not in any kind of fiction that I write, because that's a cartoon. Villains do not actually stride about going, I'm here to be bad, and that's what I like, being bad. It's like, who wants to read that? I mean, it's fine. I mean, I love Superman comic books. That's how
Sure.
I learned how to read.
Right.
But I don't want that in my reading time now. And so people are complicated and they lie to themselves and they alter the story. And good people do that, and bad people do that too. And so I'm always more interested, honestly, in good people doing bad things and bad people occasionally doing good things than I am in a narrative of good people do good things and occasionally they do a little tiny bad thing so that we can find them relatable. It's like that's not how I think about people. I think that people are complicated from the tops of their head to the tips of their toes.
Well, and as you're saying that, it kind of reminded me of talking about crime fiction not being or not considered as quote unquote serious literature earlier, but it's a genre that we turn to a lot. And I think every once in a while we go through different cycles where okay, we're really into Norwegian crime fiction right now, or we're really into cozy murder mystery set on the seaside. Agatha Christie's never gone away. And so I wonder actually, now that you've written one and you've been a fan of the genre anyway, why do you think it is that we turn to crime fiction, um, both as
Well,
entertain?
I imagine that, excuse me, I imagine that, some people have written brilliant dissertations about this already, and you and I should probably go to the shelves and go see those dissertations. But my feeling is some of it is what drives anybody to read fiction, which is to see a different world and to experience empathy and sympathy with worlds that we in which we do not live. I think there's always that. I also think that, particularly for a murder mystery, there's a certain pleasure in trying to follow the maze. I am not a puzzle solver. Like, this is not a great interest to me, but I am really interested in the way in which life unfolds. And it's just like what you were saying about plot and character. I always like a character driven story, but it doesn't take the place of plot. It's just that the plot comes about because of who people are, which is largely what I think about life. You know, you know how it is. You have two friends, God forbid, they both are in a terrible car accident, and one of those people is going to do an extraordinary job of recovery and building relationships and learning things, some for the good from the accident. The other person is going to pull down the shades, lock the door, and tell everybody to go away. And that's not because of the car accident. That's because of who people are. And so I'm always interested, including in the mystery, how people unfold and how events reveal who they are. They don't make them who they are, but they sure do show us who they are.
Well, I think this is the perfect time to ask you to read a passage from your book because I do think you have a pivotal moment with Dell that you would like to share with our listeners today.
Absolutely. So Dell is investigating a murder at a university. I slept badly, having the kind of dreams that men like Harry inspire. I woke up sweaty, damp in patches, and hearing my own groans. I showered and changed into my jeans and a t-shirt and put my hair up. It was 7 a.m., and I was ready to face the unpleasant music of more people who didn't want to talk to me. I was going to confront people and buy donuts. My plan was to ply everyone with fresh donuts. I hadn't seen this done on Law and Order, but I was doing it anyway. I got into my car and headed for town. Two rabbits lit across the road. I rode into the swerve, eased down on the brakes, and nothing happened, so I pumped them. More nothing. And then very slowly, a great deal seemed to happen. The bushes came toward my car, and I heard glass splintering and felt the steering wheel leave the dash and the airbag explode into my chest and chin. My neck was pressed against the steering wheel, and my face felt like a hard-boiled egg kicked over at a picnic. The airbag and the steering wheel, however, felt quite firm, even unyielding. Wherever I was, it was very dark. I could barely see daylight through the branches, and they were strictly decorative. I had driven into a copse of oak trees, mostly saplings, or else I'd have been dead. And the front of the car now extended about 30 inches past my feet, and there was only a wide, lacy glass pattern where the solid windshield used to be. I pushed open the door and dragged myself out, falling into a huge mountain laurel shrub. Leaves and branches crushed and crunched under me. Showers of glass came down with every move of my hands and arms. I could feel the tiny, tiny biting sprinkles of it falling from my hair to my neck and under my shirt.
So, what is it about this passage that you really wanted to share?
There's something about it. I had been actually in a terrible car accident once, and I really wanted to write about the details of that and sort of the difference between what you understand when it's happening and then the layers of understanding afterwards. And I suppose, in fact, it has to do also with the way in which I write the murder mystery,
Right.
which is what you experience in the moment is different from what you come to understand later.
We'll continue our conversation with Connecticut author Amy Bloom after the break. This is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Another reminder for our listeners that if you love author conversations and all things books, we want to meet you. On Saturday, June 13th at 10 a.m., join our team at Grace's Place in Meriden for a fun mingling and a book swap. There's no assigned reading and no pressure, just a relaxed afternoon. Registration is required. Visit ctpublic.org/whereweread to sign up. Now, let's dive back into our conversation with Connecticut author Amy Bloom. Can you give our listeners a little bit of an insight into what your process is like a writer? You know, clearly this is something that you're drawing from your own experience and inspiration, but does it always start with something real? You know, are you someone who always goes by diving into research, or do you pick on an experience first and then the words just come out to you?
Well, I love the idea that the words just come out.
I
That has
know, so
not
do
been
I.
I mean, what a nice idea.
It really is.
Um, I think if I can't hear the character, I can't write the book. It doesn't matter what kind of book it is. I have to be able to hear the voice of whoever is at the center of the story. And that's always the first thing. How they look comes much later, and the plot comes later. But to be able to hear her voice narrating the accident or talking about how she became a disgraced English professor or talking about the loss of her late mother, I had to be able to hear her so that I could write from the inside. I don't write from the outside in. I tend to write from the inside out.
As someone who has gone through so much throughout your career, you know, not only just crossing genres, but crossing different career paths, and the world is so different compared to, let's say, when you published your first book in the 90s. You know, how do you think you have changed as a writer?
Oh gosh, well, I hope I'm better. I think there's probably a little more humor, but a little less archness. I don't feel any particular need to try to be clever. It's usually a bad idea. Better to say it plainly, and if it's not clear, fix it later than to try to be clever. So I feel like I've left a lot of that behind, which is a good idea. I feel like when I first started writing, my default voice was sort of faintly Downton Abbey, which has like nothing to do with who I am or my own personal background or anything, but it was clever and English and arch, and I can't even tell you where it came from. As I say, it comes from nothing in my personal experience, but probably a lot of reading 19th century fiction when I was 10 years old.
Right.
Um, and now that doesn't come up so much. I don't have to fight to find the voice as much. And I think I'm entirely willing to spend a day finding the right word, no matter what it is that I'm writing. So that's nice. And that's partially because I have more time. When I had 3 kids and a full-time job when I started writing. And so I would write from about 10 o'clock at night to about 1 in the morning, 3 nights a week. Um, and that's the time that I had. And now it's better.
Well, and I think oftentimes we find ourselves in situations where we're forced to write, which is works for some people, doesn't work for others. Of course, it's subjective, but I do want to kind of go back to you mentioned, you can spend the whole day looking for the perfect word. And that kind of reminds me of this idea of slowness. And in the world of distraction and all of the technology advancements that we have, do you think it's important to continue to create art in the various forms that we consume them?
Oh, I hope so. I when you ask that question, it actually gives me a real pang because I think, what would it be like to be in a world in which no one wished to create art? Nobody wished to have their voice heard or the image seen or the music listened to. Oh, that would just break my heart. Um, so I hope so. I hope people continue to do it. I think that the distinction that people make between AI, which I understand has its purposes, and creative work is not an insignificant difference. And in general, not always, because sometimes people are terrible, but in general, I prefer the real thing, whether that's a human or a painting. And, I would rather live in a world in which lots of people paint and most of it's terrible and some of it is life changing than live in a world in which all of it was not too terrible, but some version of slop. That doesn't give me a lot of pleasure and it doesn't lift my soul.
Well, I asked the question because I felt the same pain when I heard this from a young person fairly recently, high school age, who is creating art. And she found herself in a position where, in the world of distraction and technology, as I mentioned earlier, questioning whether she has to defend the fact that she wants to continue to make art. And so, as somebody who has been in this position for so many years and found success and are continuing to do so, what would you tell any young artists who really want to continue to create their art, whatever that art is, but also finding themselves in a position where either they're distracted or they're not being encouraged to create art?
Well, in some sense, distracted and not being encouraged are two pieces in the sense that nobody cares as much about your art as you do. And it's not their job. It is not their job to care about your art. It is your job to care about your art. And if you cannot bring yourself to turn off your phone to do the work that feeds your soul, then what the reasonable conclusion might be, you don't care that much about the art, which is perfectly fine. You're never going to find a writer who said, what the world needs more is more writers. What writers think is we need more readers. And so if you don't love it so much that you cannot bear not to do it, that's fine. Then you are allowed not to do it because the world is never going to care about that work and serve that work the way you have the opportunity to do. And it is perfectly fine to decide to put down your pen or your paintbrush and go, this is too much for me. Nothing wrong with that at all. But it is not on anybody else to do that work and make that happen except you.
And who do you look for when you're looking for inspiration? Who are some authors that you find yourself go back to or discover as you're looking for that inspiration? Or you know what, just for something to read.
Oh, all I mean, you know, it's a great world. It's a big room, this room of literature, and so, it can be poetry, it can be uh, Zimborska, it can be Jean Valentine, it can be Mark Doty, it could be Audre Lorde, who I mentioned earlier, it can be Jane Hirschfield, whom I adore, it can be Auden, but it can also be Christie and Dorothy Sayers and Tana French and Walter Mosley. There is some book out there for everybody and for every moment, and that's what makes it, to me, such a just a great journey. You can pick up Colette, or you can pick up Evaristo. That, like, the range is so big, and there is always something, and that for me is, it's worth putting down your phone.
Just to sort of to button up this conversation here, which I know we can go on forever, is there anything happening in the world right now that is inspiring your writing today, whether it's joyful or something that you want to dissect or something you want to break barriers?
Well, there's certainly a lot going on in the world, and some of it is hopeful and encouraging, and some of it is, if you're a sentient person, makes you weep. I think most of us, I guess, in the end, sort of write as we are. And so I am always interested in, like, human variety and variations. I often say that, my view of humanity is it is a variegated bouquet, and that's what I prefer. I prefer to be surprised. Sometimes the surprises are great, sometimes they're not so great. I like to be surprised. I like to be available to be surprised. And so I think, really, I write sort of as I am, which is people in this big, complicated world, people who are not simple, people who are not necessarily all one thing or another, people who are capable of surprising even themselves, people who are capable of love, and also people who are capable of hatred. I don't mind my people being complicated, because that is how I find them.
Well, we are very excited to be surprised by you again in the future. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, this was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was Amy Bloom. She's a best-selling author based here in Connecticut, and her latest book is Blunt Instrument. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening, and happy reading, everyone.